You will now learn to configure processor-level error handling. Error handling can be configured at the processor level by adding a try-scope to a flow or subflow. You can add any number of processors to the try-scope and configure any number and combination of error scopes to handle any error that may occur in the try-scope. The rules for error handling in a try-scope are similar to what you previously learned. When an error occurs in a try-scope, the mule event is passed to the try-scope error handler, and all processors in the appropriate error scope are executed. When the error scope completes, all remaining processors in the try-scope are ignored, and the mule event is returned to the parent flow. One difference is that you can optionally configure a try-scope as a transaction, so the operations are considered one unit that either succeeds or fails. If the error scope is on error propagate, the error is rethrown in the parent flow, and if a transaction is being handled, it gets rolled back. If the error scope is on error continue, the error is resolved. The event is passed back to the parent flow to continue processing, and if a transaction is being handled, it gets committed. In the next few screens, you will examine a few processor-level error handling scenarios. In Scenario 1, the parent flow has an on-error propagate error scope and contains a try-scope with an on-error propagate error scope. As the flow is executing, an error occurs on the processor labeled E in the try-scope. Processing stops, and the event is sent to the try-scope error handler. When the processors in the error scope finish executing, it rethrows the error to the parent flow, which executes its error scope, then rethrows the error again, causing the listener to return an error response. In Scenario 2, a parent flow has an on-error continue error scope and contains a try-scope with an on-error propagate error scope. As the flow is executing, an error occurs on the processor labeled E in the try-scope. Processing stops, and the event is sent to the try-scope error handler. When the processors in the error scope finish executing, it rethrows the error to the parent flow, which executes its error scope and resolves the error, so the listener returns a successful response. In Scenario 3, the parent flow has either an on-error propagate or continue error scope and contains a try-scope with an on-error continue error scope. As the flow is executing, an error occurs on the processor labeled E in the try-scope. Processing stops, and the event is sent to the try-scope error handler. When the processors in the error scope finish executing, it resolves the error and returns the event to the parent flow, which continues to execute the rest of the processors in the flow. The response that is returned to the client depends on what happens in the subsequent processors and the type of error scope in the parent flow. In the fifth walkthrough, you will wrap each of the flow references in the scatter-gather with a try-scope and use an on-error continue scope to replace any error messages with an empty array so that only successful results are returned.